German immigrants were feared in the United States because of supposed connection to anarchist terrorism, as in the Haymarket bombing of 1886 that killed 7 policemen. Italians were later tarred with a similar brush both before and after the 1920 Wall Street bombing that killed 30 people. And Irish revolutionaries were feared and despised for many years, for decades, if not for their Catholicism, then for their sometimes violent activism for a free Ireland. We forget the Fenian movement, the kind of terrorist national liberation movement that existed in the United States, which actually tried to invade Canada from US soil in 1866. So when we think of these foreigners coming in with their outlandish ways and doing things we don't like, we're not talking about Muslims. This is actually a part of American history. This is actually a part of the human experience. And speaking of religion, prejudice certainly against Catholics and against their foreign ways and supposed foreign control was a staple of 19th and 20th century populist culture. I recall the famous, infamous Harper's Weekly cartoon in 1875. Some of you may have seen it. Thomas, the great American political cartoonist, Thomas Nast, which shows Catholic clergy emerging as crocodiles. Their kind of headdress opening up like the mouths of crocodile to devour the nation's children. Children, by the way, which are shown as white, black, American Indian, and Chinese. The idea was, of course, that Catholic parochial schools were going to destroy public education in the United States and brainwash American children into popery. A benevolent organization that I belong to, the Knights of Columbus, was founded, in fact, at that time in 1882 to protect Catholic immigrants against nativist groups like the KKK. Such a history should give both American Muslims and their many supporters and the critics pause. For Muslims who feel that they are being unfairly victimized, and they sometimes are, they should realize that this has happened before and that it was overcome. For the critics who sometimes promote the idea that Islam or Muslims is some kind of unassimilable or unacceptable lump in the body politic, they need to realize also that this has happened before, and that innocent majorities were vilified for the actions of a few, and that understandable fear was often manipulated by bigots. This is an ugly pattern to understand and avoid and not to mimic. We've been there before. And of course, understanding our past, our complex and sometimes dark past, should be a clarion call to avoid at all costs repeating them. But the second point I would make, which I think is important in the discourse and some of the things that we've heard, is that we should understand and respect, doesn't mean we need to like it, the power and seductiveness of the violent ideology that we are often talking about. It doesn't need to be minimized. It also doesn't need to be exaggerated. As the well-respected George Washington University Program on Extremism noted in its launch in 2015 of its ISIS in America report, the phenomenon of Americans joining jihadist groups is not new, but the size of the ISIS-related radicalization and mobilization is unprecedented. I was a speaker at that launch, and I tried to kind of square the circle, because you have like two discourses occurring. One is, all those Muslims, they're all terrorists, they're coming together. So the other one is, nobody is, no Muslim is a terrorist, kind of mirror images of each other. And I tried to put this in context at the conference by noting that the level of ISIS mobilization that occurred in America and Western Europe at its height was unprecedented, was a real success by ISIS. And even though it was a real accomplishment by them, it was a success that succeeded in mobilizing only a tiny percentage of Muslims in the West and in the world. So something can be both an unprecedented, real success, a real bad thing, And also be put in context that not to overstate it, not to go overboard. That is not to say that support for ISIS at its height in 2015 was negligible. It was a small minority of Muslims worldwide, but a minority of millions. A 2015 Pew Research study reassuringly titled, "In Nations with Significant Muslim Populations, Much Disdain for ISIS," showed 9% of Pakistanis with a favorable view of ISIS. That's 20 million people. The same poll showed 14% in Nigeria had a positive view of ISIS. That's 26 million people. The same poll statistically showed millions in Turkey, Malaysia, Indonesia, and Senegal were willing to openly tell a pollster that they had a positive view of this most notorious of groups. Given the large numbers in the study who said that they had no opinion of the group, one can guess that the popularity of the Islamic State only 2 years ago was even higher than the pollsters respect the nature of the threat without going overboard. This is an attractive, revolutionary ideology which harnessed with a great sense of urgency a specific Salafi jihadist worldview with the pulse of youth revolt communicated through social media in a powerful way. ISIS, the political military entity, is being crushed in the Middle East, and its utopian appeal is disappearing. That was one of the big things that drew it. It drew some young Americans to join it. As this young 20-year-old young woman from Mississippi said she wanted to go to Raqqa and raise a family and have a lot of little caliphate babies. That part of the appeal has gone. But some of it remains. The idea of jihadism as a revolutionary ideal remains. And it's part of a broader spectrum of contending Islamist and jihadist ideologies, some of which are politically intolerant, some of which are violent, which are deeply anti-American and destructive of human fellowship and flourishing. I want to drill down a little bit on the pillars of the ideology, because I want to make a larger point. If we look at, we talk about the danger of Salafi jihadism, kind of people talk about Al-Qaeda and ISIS. You have three key mobilizing pillars of the ideology. There's a lot of, as often comes when people discuss the question of Muslims and national security, there's a lot of background noise that people bring up that is irrelevant or used to basically vilify people, vilify communities, kind of ridiculous discussion about Sharia or, the hijab or the Muslim mosques and all of that. If you look at the poisonous ideology that we're talking about, that is one of the reasons why we are here today, it's actually, the key pillars are actually very limited, very specific, and very narrow. The first is a concept of the use of violence, often typified by that word, the phrase, jihad fi sabilillah. What jihadist groups do, which actually is breathtakingly fascinating, which is they upend 14 centuries of Islamic history and put it on its head. For most of Islamic history, jihad, that scary word, I actually know several Syrian Christians whose first name is jihad, which is always an interesting conversation they have when they come to the United States. Jihad meant war. That's all it meant. And it meant war declared by the ruler, the sultan, the emir, the prince, or whatever. The idea that ISIS and Al-Qaeda propagates, the one that so often concerns us and so often causes fear among people, which is of some guy all of a sudden getting up and doing some evil thing, shooting people or running people over with a car, stabbing people, is ahistorical. This is a modern innovation which has not existed in Islamic history but only the past few decades. This is always so important to remember that what jihadists do is, in a way, do a kind of fabrication, a kind of fantasy version of what Islamic history really is. And they get rid of all the nuance, all of the complexity, all the contradictions of 14 centuries of human experience and spiritual life and reduce it to a very, dumbed down version for the easily fooled. So number one is this idea of jihad as something which is done by individuals, which is, as I said, Sayyid Qutb in the 1960s, and then various of the Egyptian jihadists in the 1970s popularized this idea, which Al-Qaeda and ISIS talks about, which is, don't ask your imam, don't ask your mom and dad, just go out and kill somebody. This is an innovation in the history of Islam. This is not something that actually exists in Islamic history. The second pillar, of course, of this kind of mobilization is the question of legitimate authority, typified by the term that Salafi jihadists use, al-wala wal-bara, right? Wala, loyalty to whom, and bara, disavow to what? The idea that a Muslim is loyal to the Muslims, or some Muslim entity that exists out there. So they're not Americans, they're not Egyptians, they're not Jordanians, they're not Pakistanis, they're this other thing. That, of course, obviously is also profoundly ahistorical, manufactured thing that is put out there. The third element of the jihadist use of kind of mobilization is the concept of otherizing the other, right? Of otherizing groups that are seen as beyond the pale. This is often, often non-Muslims, but often even heterodox Muslims considered beyond the pale. So you see the weaponizing of words like kafir, like mushrik, like murtad, infidel, polytheist, apostate. Jihadists have successfully mined and weaponized these particular terms, discarding elements that do not fit in the overall story they are seeking to tell. So they're indeed misquoting and misstating sacred writ, but it is a misquoting that can and does rely on real communities of people who see the world that way to a certain extent. To put it another way, the number of devotees who would see a person as a kafir or a mushrik is larger than that of actual ISIS supporters. I think it's really important to be specific about the ideology, because as I said, all too often when we talk about American Muslims and their concerns and the question of people being targeted, it's often about other things. It's often about ignorance, it's often about bigotry, it's often about fear of religious competition. When toxic ideological cocktail seems powerful, and it is, I said, but it's only succeeded in mobilizing small groups in the West. And I think it's important also to realize that what I just described is actually not that Muslim. If you think about it, the extremist violence that I described is not that unique to religious and ethnic groups. We talk